Hello and welcome everybody to my YouTube channel. My name is Louisa. Thank you very much for joining me today to spend some of your time thinking about ways that you can heal yourself and potentially have a really positive, beneficial impact on your family and the world, because that's what healing work is. It's very much a service to those around us. So my YouTube channel is called Healing with Words because I'm very interested in the deep personal healing that's going on for so many people on our planet and the impact that that's having. We're really truly liberating ourselves from a lot of darkness and a lot of transgenerational trauma that's come down through the generations now for centuries. So this is an exciting time of intense darkness, but intense capacity to be liberated as well, intense lightness. So I have a history, as some of you know, of diagnoses, mental health diagnoses of borderline personality disorder and dissociative identity disorder. Now, I don't want to get hung up on diagnoses or suggest that this video is only for those people who share those diagnoses. Absolutely not. It's not exclusive, but I just want to mention it because both of those diagnoses are strongly correlated and connected to issues with the family of origin. So your birth family, what happened in that birth family, how well you attached to your parents, what was allowed in the family and what wasn't, and the potential trauma that came out of that, the way that you were treated. And again, it's not necessarily to say that you would call it abuse or that it was a particularly negative, objectively negative experience, but many souls that have been born at this time are highly sensitive beings who have literally come here to free the planet, I guess, in consciousness, to rise in consciousness, to bring new ideas and new ways of being with each other. So for those sensitive souls to be born into a family where there was lots of repressed emotion and unsaid conflict, secrets, toxic secrets festering in the family, inauthenticity, even the emotional neglect that often comes in the typical family of today can be very damaging, very wounding to that person and can require healing. So so that was certainly the case for me. I had a really well-intentioned, beautiful family who loved me a lot and a great deal, as much as parents can love a child, and yet there were some big gaps in the upbringing that created problems for me later on, problems in my development of my personality. So that because of that situation that many of us find ourselves in, that we've had problems growing up in our family, then as adults we've got some healing work to do, and it's the healing work on behalf of, as I said, everybody. It's not just healing work for you. You're actually helping to liberate and heal your family as well, and all the bloodlines, the ancestral lines of your mother and your father. You're doing healing work for them as well. So the stuff is extremely powerful, and so honorable as well. I mean, I know sometimes it can feel like it's not fair, or why are you the one that, if you feel like you're the one dealing with it all and everyone else is ignoring it, but because you can, because you have taken upon yourself that task in this lifetime to do that work. So it's a special thing. You might not feel it's special right now, but let's see which stage you're at. So what I want to do is share the stages that I see in this healing journey, and then suggest how to work at those different stages. So the first stage, I would say, would be the stage what I call the blaming the self. So there might have, as you were growing up, you might have developed quite a crippled personality. It's almost like you're a plant trying to grow in soil that is just not nurturing you. So you kind of grow all, gnarly and and bent and misshapen. Your personality is perhaps not fully allowed to express itself. So maybe you lived in a household where a lot of free emotional expression and play wasn't allowed, so you had to repress that side of yourself. maybe you lived in a household where you couldn't cry, where you couldn't feel your grief or distress, where that was shut down. So something in your family, there would have been patterns where something wasn't okay, and whatever was repressed in the family is going to now be, it's going to seem to you to be a flaw. So in this blaming the self phase that you go through, you basically think that your family's right. Like whatever the messages were that they gave you about your inadequacies and flaws and faults, you're too loud, you're too weak, you're too sensitive, you're not smart enough, you're never going to amount to anything, I don't know, whatever it was. And it's often not overt, it's not overtly spoken, it's subtle. It's a message that we receive in body language, in what isn't spoken about, more so than what is spoken about. So, have a real think about the pivotal moments in your childhood that you can remember, the memories. You will have remembered them for a reason, and think about the messages that you got from those memories. That might be some clues as to the kinds of messages you internalized about your own self, and that becomes your sense of failure and lack and inadequacy that you carry with you, what psychologists call your core beliefs, the negative core beliefs. I speak about negative core beliefs lots, so check out some of my other videos as well, especially Journey to Integration, that series. Anyway, so we take, we internalize those messages, and then we blame ourselves for either for having the inadequacy in the first place, or then later on as we grow up, we might sort of rebel against what our family wished for us, or tried the box that they tried to kind of squeeze us into, and then blame ourselves for that. So self-blame is definitely the first stage that you go through, and in that stage you tend to perceive the opinions of your family, especially your parents. Remember that they're like gods to you when you're little. So whatever they said to you, it sinks in the deepest layers of memory, the deepest imprints that our minds have in this earthly form. Anyway, there's much deeper ones from other lives and other dimensions. But in this life, they are critical. So whatever they said, whatever they believed, and it could also be that you're carrying their inadequacies, their sense of failures. In fact, that's highly likely that they pass them on to you. Much of it unspoken, but if you go back and you do therapy work on this, you'll start to connect the dots and realize the patterns that they carried that you're now carrying. So you will blame yourself because they seem like gods and you're only the child and you must be wrong. And that little inner child, it follows, journeys with you as you grow up. So you might be a 25-year-old, but you still have an inner child that feels like a failure, let's say, or not being good enough. And nothing will ever be good enough until you do this work. So the first stage is, I guess, to realize that you're blaming yourself, because that self-blame, until you pick it up and see it, it could lead you down a path of great self-destruction, because you're almost unconsciously punishing yourself. You might have relationships with people that put you down, so you can validate that self-blame. You might pick up addictions. You might almost self-sabotage your successes, not fully allowing yourself to live the way you really want to live. I don't know, let's say that you dream of just going to the country and raising chickens, but your family was a very academic, career-orientated family. So you prevent yourself from just living your dream because it's a wrong dream. That's the message you've been given, right? So there's lots and lots of ways that the self-blame phase can play out, and especially if you don't catch it, like you could get through your whole life and not proceed past this stage. I know adults who are, very old and at the ends of their lives, and they still haven't seen this. So the next stage, and before I actually continue, I have to say that it's not linear. Nothing ever is linear. So some people might some people might actually get these stages the other way around. But let's just say another stage is blaming the family stage. So if you are a blaming the self type and you start to do some therapy, let's say, and you start to realize that a lot of the stuff comes from your childhood, what could happen then is you transition into the blaming the family stage. So this is where you look back and go, oh my goodness, it wasn't me, it was them all along. Look at the terrible way that they parented me. Look at this that happened, that happened, etc., etc. And you put all the blame on them, right? So this is a good stage to go through in some senses, because the self-blame stage is very harmful to you. And the blaming the family stage is really important, because what you're doing is you're giving back the power to that inner child that once felt so crushed by whatever it was, the messages that were given, or in some cases the actual abuse that was dished out. So that little child, you are wrapping, it's like metaphorically wrapping your arms around that little child and saying, yeah, what they did was really mean, or that really hurt you, you know. And that's important to do that, because that little child needs to hear that it's not the child's fault. So in an abuse or neglect situation with any child, it's never their fault. So it wasn't your fault. And that message has to be given over and over and over again to yourself, because your little child won't believe it to begin with. And you know, it's such a burden that this child is carrying, the sense of blame and shame. So you do want to remove it. It's really important to remove it and put it where it belongs, in a sense. I mean, we'll go deeper into it in a minute, but for the moment, just say that one aspect of the story is that, yes, these needs were not met in your childhood. Yes, this happened or that happened and it hurt you. There was a wounding, and just simply acknowledging that. So during this stage, it gets really, really tricky. It's a very tough stage to go through in your healing. And a lot of people give up at this stage. They retreat back into the self-blame. They never quite push through this stage, because it creates so many issues with your family of origin. You know, imagine that you've all been sitting around reading off a script for your whole lives, and now suddenly you're looking at your script and going, I don't like this script. This is painting me out to be the bad guy. I'm going to have a new script, and my new script says that you're the bad guy. You can imagine how your family are going to react. You know, most families cannot hear that message, because they are entrenched in their own issues, which we'll talk about in a minute. So they're not going to want to hear that script. And it's, you know, it's quite rare, I think, where it's not impossible, but it's rare, where somebody who has shifted from self-blame to blaming the family and started to open up the cupboard and let the skeletons of the family out, where that family is like, oh yeah, no, we're willing to listen, we're open to that. Oh, that's really interesting that you feel that way. You know, usually if families ever get to that point, it takes years, because remember, you're the one doing the healing work, you're ready for it. And now if you suddenly put this new story out there to your family, they're very likely to turn around and go, that's rubbish. You're making that up, you're lying, you've gone crazy. If you have a diagnosis, you may well get accused of having a mental illness. So there's going to be a lot of denial, and you know, it's a really tough stage, because that can kind of, I would say I went through that stage for, I guess, you know, like I said, you go in and out of these stages. It's not entirely linear, but I went through the stage in earnest for probably 6 or 7 years, maybe longer, with my family. And it was a back and forth. It was me creating a story through piecing together my childhood and my understanding of it and my meaning making. And then I would kind of try to change things with my family. I try to maybe write a letter or have a conversation, or at one point I wrote a memoir. And yeah, it was just really tough because they tried sometimes sort of to hear my story, but it wasn't really penetrating or changing their story. So with one exception really, my mum, and again, there may be one or two people in your family that are willing to come on this journey with you, but my mum certainly did listen and did her absolute best to try to meet me. So I'll talk about mum again in a second because that's the next part of what I wanted to say. But for the moment, just to say that it is a really tough stage, and be prepared for it. But my advice at this stage is to really surround yourself with people who do validate you. I read a lot of books. Books were my absolute friend at this point because they were like my army of experts behind me saying, this happens a lot with children. This is what attachment disorder is. This is what borderline personality disorder is. This is, I kind of used all the psychology evidence base that I could to validate myself, because it's about that. It's quite hard to hold that point of view. It can really mess with your mind when you're trying to tell a story and then your family's saying that story is false. It's going to be quite difficult to hold your ground. So yeah, but working at it, it was very important because then I was able to become my inner child's defender and stand up for my story and what had happened to me and that inner child. So, okay, stage 3 is the liberating stage, really. This is the one that you need to get to. So the other two are important and you're going to go through them, but what you want to get to, and I didn't really give this a name, blaming the universe, but it isn't blame, it's absolving, it's the absolving stage. Yeah, let's call it that. So this stage really, it requires, it's kind of it's a synthesis of everything you've discovered about yourself. So all the stuff you learn about yourself when you were going through the blaming the self stage, all that introspection and self-reflection and, oh my God, I do this and I do that and I'm such a terrible person. And, this is one advantage of the inner critic. I know that everybody hates to have an inner critic, especially a really abusive one, but that part of you is also, I guess, a very self-analytical part. It's the part that kind of observes you and watches you all the time. And with a lot of work, that part can be trained to be quite a neutral observer rather than a critical observer. And so you do develop through an inner critic, you develop this ability to really analyze and watch yourself. And that's important. That's really important. You're going to need that for this third stage, this high level of self-awareness that you develop. And it's one of the gifts actually of coming through a family unit where there was a lot of tension and problems, because the child learns to develop a state of hypervigilance and tends to become very self-aware and aware of others. So from this we develop a harsh inner critic, but we also develop a high degree of empathy, ability to read other people's emotions and feel into what they need. And we develop this, as I said, this critical, aware, self-aware part. The word critical is interesting because it can mean, in academia, it doesn't mean to judge negatively. Well, it sort of does, but it's just got a more neutral connotation, like to just be a critical thinker, is to ask questions, to never take anything as just read or assume things. So it can have a good connotation as well. Right, so you're going to need that self-aware part that's come from blaming the self stage, and then the blaming the family stage. Now that's a very emotional part. That's blaming the family stage. I didn't talk about this, but you can get in there and get really angry at your mum and dad, or you can cry over the absence, the loss of whatever it was that you needed. Or because there's going to be some big emotions sitting in there, some big grief, some big anger, rage, really. Children hold enormous emotions. They're very raw, they're very primal, and when they're shut down in childhood, they get repressed and they sit in there waiting for us to let them out again. So they're going to go. And I have also made some videos on these sorts of things, like sitting with distressing feelings is a really good one to watch. And the grief, the Angel of Grief video, I recommend that you watch that one. But this stage, blaming the family, teaches you to feel your emotions, to honour your emotions, to side with yourself when you need to. And the other thing it does is it helps you start to make meaning and sense of the family story, the big story of your family. And you will find as you move out of the blaming the family, that is the immediate family, you're going to start to look at mum and dad's mum and dad. What happened to them that created their parenting skills? What happened to them that negated their ability to give you what you needed? Maybe they were overcompensating. Maybe they came from a super strict family and then they gave you everything, but it felt like smothering to you. They thought they were giving you the world and you felt smothered. Were they overcompensating for something in their history? Or did they directly repeat the pattern of their parenting? And you know, most of us have either a generation or the generation before, grandparents or great-grandparents that came out of the war years on our planet. So this is in the Western cultures, you know, well, it was Eastern as well. It's, you know, the world wars. So there's a lot of trauma from those generations that was never dealt with, which then got passed on. And, you know, I encourage you to have a look at your great-grandparents, your grandparents. What kinds of people were they? What sort of upbringing did your parents have? To try and piece together, and I guarantee you will find patterns, and you will see that, okay, mum and dad did this to me, but this is why. And when you start to understand that, then you're beginning this liberating phase. Because, you know, maybe this whole thing is a meaning making in a sense, because in the first stage, when you're blaming yourself, you're saying, I did all this, this is the way I've lived my life, and this is who I've become. But why? Then you look over at your family and you blame them and you go, well, I'm this way I am because of them. And then you look further afield and you go, wait a minute, why am my family like that? Because of them. And so it goes down the ancestral line. It goes down the ancestral line, and it also goes, it's more holistic than that as well, because you know, we're all connected. We're living in an energetic field of time and space, and so our environment is impacting us all the time. What we're being fed through the media, what we're being told in textbooks and schools, our programming, our indoctrination that we all go through, all this stuff feeds into why you were treated the way you were treated. You know, I know with my family, when mum and dad were first becoming parents, the wisdom at the time was that if your baby cries, you know, for feeding, you just shove it in a room and wait for it to stop. So you're basically abandoning your baby when it's crying, which I'm sure tortured mothers, because they kind of knew instinctively that that wasn't a good thing to do. I can't even leave my cat when it's crying and it needs me. You know, this overriding our primal instincts because some textbook told us to do that. So think about where they came from, think about what they went through and why they might be the way they are. And when you get to this stage, this compassion starts to come up. When you're blaming your family, you start to have compassion for yourself, which is really great. You'll start to go, oh, you know, actually I can let myself off the hook here. You know, I am the way I am because of all this, and it's okay. You know, like I've had a rough time. It's compassion speaking when you speak like that, and then you begin to have compassion for yourself and your family, and this is a really important time as well. So within those stages are going to be, you know, I guess I'm talking here about the inner landscape, the inner transformation that happens. But what happens on the outside, there's also practical elements to this. There's the actual relationship that you have with these people. And, this is tough stuff to deal with. I feel like I've gone through every shade of possibility of what could happen. I have, tried many conversations to. I suppose what I wanted from my family at that time was understanding and validation, and basically for them to say, oh, okay, that's interesting that you should feel that way, or that you're like this, because I didn't want to be blamed and judged. I felt they were blaming and judging me. And as I got more and more authentic in my own life, I felt more and more like the black sheep of the family. So I tried to fix that problem, I suppose, by trying to help them understand me through letters and conversations, but it really didn't work at all. And long story short, things blew up one day, and this is really common. The more you separate, the more likely the tension grows and grows between you. So the more your story goes this way and their story goes that way, the tension builds and then snaps. Something will happen. I do talk about this in another video, which is separating from family, a spiritual perspective. So check that one out as well. Yeah, so we had a snap. We had a big blow up. That led to quite a long period of estrangement, not talking at all. I actually grieved for my family as if I'd lost them, as if I was never going to see them again. That was how it felt at the time. And then since then, after about 18 months of that, I actually felt amazing after 18 months. I went through deep grief, and it wasn't fun, but it was very clearing and liberating for me. And then once I did that, I was able to start reconnecting. I have an analogy which I want to share with you, which is, on the issue of reconnecting. Be really careful, because this is a danger period. If you've done an awful lot of work, and you've got to a certain point where you've created some really good boundaries, you've been practicing your self-assertion tools, you've said no to things, you're keeping yourself safe, you're avoiding triggers, you've set up your life in such a way that's really good. Maybe you went interstate, maybe you went overseas. I don't know how it looks for you, but you've created enough separation, whether it's total estrangement or just stepping back and kind of going in the background. When you go back, quite often all those old patterns can get re-triggered, and you might still deeply long to have those heartfelt connections with your family member, because ultimately we love each other, right? We love each other. The most abusive situation, two people in the most abusive situation, a persecuted victim, will still love each other, and that just, it is testimony actually to the human heart and the power of the human heart, that there's still this bond. But we have to be so careful, because those patterns will get reactivated. And the way I see this is, it's a bridge, right? So imagine if you have two people, A and B, and let's say me and my mum, because my mum is a beautiful example of this. So I'm over here and mum's over here. We're in different worlds. We're not understanding each other. We have two very different stories about what happened in our reality, in my childhood, and in our current relationship. So what we do is we try to build a bridge between the two people. And I walked like this halfway. I walked halfway by, sitting down with mum over a coffee and having long conversations to try to explain what had happened. My mum met me halfway by listening, without judgment, open-mindedly, by trying to understand. I would show her all these pictures, and I would talk to her about how I felt the childhood had been. And mum listened. And, you can't, it's hard to quantify these things, but it was a sense that she was open. It was a sense that she wasn't judging. It was a sense that she could hear enough of the story and validate enough of the story for me to be happy. And I didn't need her to come all the way over to my side and see everything from my point of view, nor did I need to go all the way into her camp. We just had to meet halfway. And you'll know what halfway feels like with a person. You'll just feel it. You'll feel a sense of hearing each other, a sense of shared respect, equality, balance in the relationship, harmony, peace. It will feel good. Right? And it will be enough. That will be enough for you probably to sustain a relationship over time. You know, and my relationship now, a few years later with my mum, is really, really good. I can feel openness in my heart. I love her. I'm happy when she calls. I'm happy to call her. You know, so it's a good example. Now, other relationships in my life have not been like that. I feel as if I've tried to walk halfway on the bridge and no one's been there to meet me. The other person is here going, no, not buying any of your story. You've got to come over into this camp. So when that happens, there really isn't, my advice would be not to try to go back into the old paradigm, the old family dynamic, because it is a lose-lose in my opinion. You're never going to change that relationship. So my I guess strategy with those kinds of people is just to wait. If I get a signal that the person is able to come halfway up the bridge, then I will meet them there any day. That bridge is always there. Like people say, the door is always open, yeah? But it's got to be halfway. So, you know, and again, this requires a lot of self-reflection, because I have to think, am I the one standing over here refusing to come halfway on the bridge? Maybe that's how they perceive it, in which case that's fair, that's valid. You know, one thing I've learned in this stage 3, which is looking at the big picture, the liberation stage, is that we have to hold space for the validity and truth of all stories. So if this is my story and I'm presenting as a true and I want respect for that truth, then I have to give that to other people, because to do otherwise is not mature, it's not wise, it's not the fully evolved, multidimensional self that we can be. When we are a multidimensional self, we can see things from many, many points of view, right? We become multidimensional. What is a dimension? Well, there are densities, earthly density and higher densities, but you could also say that every human being is a dimension unto themselves, because it's a contained experience that we call Louisa's world, Louisa's perception of the universe. But as I become a multidimensional being, I expand open, I'm able to not only experience the world through Louisa's eyes, but I can also partly, and sometimes the better you get at this, the more you can do it, I can experience the world from someone else's point of view as well. That's called empathy. That's the ability to literally be in another's point of view and see it. So, you know, if you're at that point, then you'll be able to judge whether you're just being obstinate and still sitting in blame and self-judgment of your family, or whether you're being true to the thing that's benefiting you the most, your own beneficial truth right now. You know, we have to hold truth really, really lightly, because it's always changing, you know. And in my memoir, I remember writing, you know, this is my story at this current time. It was 2010. But I put in there a line by a wise mystic, Gangaji. She wrote, that one day you will have to drop all of the stories. And they are only stories. So hold them lightly. Remember that you need a story, just like you need an ego, you need a personality to live in this world and get by. But it isn't you, it's not everything. It's just an aspect of you. Just like the story is an aspect of your entire experience as an infinite being. So yeah, I guess it's a way you're kind of expanding all the time, blaming the self, blaming the family, and then expanding into the sense of liberation where you understand. And that space of understanding is what's going to bring you peace. Because the other mistake people can make is getting really bogged down in holding on to their stories so tightly. You often see this with estrangement. So, you know, estrangement is not good or bad. It's okay to estrange from your family if that's the only way that you can love them from afar. Sometimes that is the best way to love a family, because going into their energy field recreates those negative dynamics, which triggers old timelines, which triggers your grief, your hurt, and their story as well. So sometimes estrangement is the best thing. But it must be done with this wisdom that I'm describing in this video, because the other way of estranging is where I've estranged, but I'm sitting in blame. I'm estranged because they're bad people, because they're toxic. You know, I sometimes get a little bit, it makes me uncomfortable to hear people say that person's a toxic person. You know, maybe toxic to you, but they are not toxic. You know, I don't want us to put labels on it. I know people that are perhaps toxic for me because I get triggered and I can't function very well in their energy, with their energy field. But those people are also really beautiful human beings in other contexts. A beautiful father, a beautiful, I don't know, boss, or you know, they bring light somewhere in their lives. They're not toxic people. There are, of course, extreme cases of personalities that have a toxic effect on a lot of people, most people that they meet. But again, the wise soul will look at that person and go, wow, that person's in a lot of pain. That's a very painful situation to be in. And I don't necessarily need to get in there and save them or help them, or, you know, having compassion for a person does not mean you need to go back into that relationship. Forgiving people doesn't mean you have to reconcile and be with them every day, or even go out to Christmas with them. Reconciliation, for me, is about reconciling in your heart. How do I feel about this person? Can I send them love? Can I be loving towards them? And I have found that, you know, I did have at one point a goal, a very lofty goal, to be able to, at any time, be around my family and not be ruffled by that whatsoever, always sending out vibrations of love and peace. And what do you know? It doesn't work yet anyway. Maybe I'm not evolved enough, but what I've discovered is that I just have to accept where I am, you know, and if I can't do that, then I'm going to be far better off to remove myself, love from afar. You know, when my family members enter my thoughts, I can hold those thoughts with love. That's really the work, you know. If you can do that, then you're doing a great job. So how loving can you be? And then I think when you get to that stage, you also become really grateful for these relationships, because you realize, wow, without these relationships, could I ever have cultivated this much, you know, compassion and love for myself and for other human beings? And I know that I'm a vastly different person through the stages that I've described here. As I said, there was a 7 or 8 year period, but it's been about 10 years now of intense work on separating from family. Sometimes literally, sometimes more metaphorically, energetically, spiritually. But without them there to act as those characters in my life for growth, like where would the motivation have been? Where would the push have been from? So they're my teachers, wonderful, beautiful, amazing teachers. So yeah, I just don't necessarily, you know, get along with them in everyday life. That's okay. That's all right. That's where it's at. So I really hope that's helpful for people. Yeah, I mean, as with all of my videos, I feel like I can talk about lots of different aspects of this, but I try to kind of keep it on a track. And yeah, just make some comments, ask some questions if there's other things left unsaid. Watch Separating from Family, a Spiritual Perspective, because I kind of talk about this, but in other ways. And yeah, just so much love and blessings to you all on this journey. Just remember that the work you're doing is super, super important. If you can be the one in a family line who heals the self, then, you know, that's heroic in my opinion. And you might feel like you're the black sheep, the broken one, the one who has all the problems, and that's very common for the family to dump those kinds of labels on you. But, you know, again, that's a challenge to rise above their judgment, their criticism, to own your experiences, to honor your experiences, to say, this is what's been given to me and I'm going to make the most of this. I'm going to work hard on this. And the work is about love. The work is about loving the self and loving the family and loving the world. You know, it kind of goes out like that. So, okay, that's enough said. Take care, all the best, and I'll see you in another video. Namaste.